How are you?
I am good. I'm so glad you made it. And we are um, going to share this with lots and lots of people. So
Oh, fantastic.
here we go.
All
Um,
right.
I'm going to just jump right into things here. We got the Fung library over here, but the newest one, the diabetes code. Um, it's a revolutionary approach to diabetes. First question is, how come it took so long for someone to come along and state things so obvious that the medical profession should know?
Um, well, I think it's because there's several factors. One is that we believed for many, many years that type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes, all the damage was caused by the high blood glucose. So if that's the case, then you simply give lots and lots of insulin, get that blood glucose down, and everything's sort of hunky-dory. Except that it wasn't. All these patients were still having heart attacks, still having strokes. And of course, that insulin it does get the blood glucose down, but doesn't actually get rid of the glucose. It just simply forces that glucose from the blood into your body. So your body turns it into fat, for example, and then you gain weight with the insulin. And if it goes into the heart and the lungs and the kidneys and so on, all of those organs just start to rot. So it wasn't until about 10 years ago that we actually had the studies that suggested that doing that this wasn't doing any good. So it was 2008. There's several studies called the Accord study and the Advanced study. There's also something called the VADT and the Origin study. So really large multinational randomized controlled trials that said that using lots of drugs to lower blood glucose wasn't really making people healthier. And so it wasn't really until about 10 years ago that people started to look at what was wrong with our sort of paradigm of diabetes treatment. Now that we look back on it, it should have been obvious. That is, you're taking a dietary disease and you're just piling on drugs and then wondering why these drugs aren't making a difference. It's because you're using drugs to treat a dietary disease. You should have treated the underlying cause, which is the diet in the first place. So that's part of the reason. So so part of the reason is that we've sort of always been focused on the blood glucose rather than the sort of all the sugar that's kind of going into our system and also the blood insulin. The other thing is that there's a lot of sort of conflicts of interest in medicine, so that a lot of companies make a lot of money on these diabetes drugs.
I,
So
I was going to go there. American Heart Association, American Diabetes
uh,
Association. Why aren't they lifting you up on a table and walking around and say, this guy's got the answer?
well, because millions of dollars of their funding depends on these drug companies selling lots of drugs. So if everybody just does some fasting and gets better, they're not going to make a lot of money. And if you start telling people the truth, which is that these drugs, they can lower your blood glucose, but they don't actually make you healthier. They don't prevent heart attacks. They don't prevent strokes. They're not going to sell drugs, and the American Diabetes Association is not going to get all that money. So I make the point in the book that if you look at guidelines, for example, which are very influential. So guidelines, when they're written, basically dictate how the disease is treated. So if the American Diabetes Association puts out a guideline and says use lots of drugs to get the sugars down, then what happens is that every doctor sort of has to do that. Otherwise, they don't meet the sort of standard of care. The people writing the guidelines, like, I don't know, 80% of them take a lot of money from these drug companies. So they're not exactly unbiased experts. Most of them get hundreds of thousands of dollars from drug companies. So they're naturally look very favorably on these drugs and think these drugs are great and we should be giving a lot of drugs. Um, and that's been the other big problem, is this sort of conflicts of interest in medicine, which is a very big issue because in almost every other field of practice, we don't allow this sort of thing. So, for example, if you look at the law profession, you're not allowed. You don't allow, say, Monsanto or somebody to pay a judge a few $100,000. You don't allow like a marijuana company to pay police officers a couple $100,000, or you don't allow people to, like McDonald's, to pay your child's teacher a few $1,000s. It's bribery. But when pharmaceuticals pay doctors to give an opinion that is favorable to them, it's just like, oh, hey, yeah, that's fine. And now that it's all open, so, on ProPublica, they have a listing of how much doctors take from pharmaceuticals. A lot of these people take like four or $500,000. And the worst part is that the worst offenders are the most influential people. So the university professors, the people at Harvard, the people at Yale, that's who they want to influence. So the pharmaceuticals give them a lot of money, and they're the ones making the opinion. So there's a lot of conflicts of interest in diabetes, and there's a whole interest in labeling people diabetic and pre-diabetic and trying to convince them that they need to take drugs. It's good business.
Dr. Fung, I began this journey with hearing two words that I didn't understand, and you've done the most comprehensive and understandable chapter in your new book on it. Metabolic syndrome, Syndrome X. What is it? Why do so many people have it? And what do you do with it?
Yeah, Syndrome X is this sort of cluster of risk factors for heart disease. So if you look at what the definition is, it's a combination of sort of abdominal obesity. So waist circumference is the major factor. So keeping in mind that body weight or body mass index is actually not one of the factors that is used in calculation of metabolic syndrome. It's actually waist circumference. So the fat around your waist, which is the most common, is actually the most dangerous sort of fat that you can accumulate. So waist circumference, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. And again, when you look at the cholesterol numbers, it's not the LDL, which is the so-called bad cholesterol. That number is not in the definition. It's actually the HDL, which is the so-called good cholesterol, and triglycerides, which are highly related to the insulin levels and blood glucose and so on. So anyway, this is a cluster of risk factors for heart disease. All of them raise your risk of heart disease, raise your risk of stroke. So the reason we care so much about metabolic syndrome, which used to be called Syndrome X, is because if you have all these different risk factors, then your risk of heart disease is going to be much, much higher. Initially, it was called Syndrome X because Gerald Reaven, who described it, figured that all of these risk factors must have a sort of commonality between them. So the high blood pressure, high blood sugars, abdominal obesity, they must have something in common which is driving this. And it turns out he was exactly right. And what was driving it is basically hyperinsulinemia. So a lot of people call it insulin resistance. It's actually the same thing. So insulin resistance refers to the state where the body does not respond normally to the insulin. Insulin should push the glucose into a cell, but because it doesn't, the glucose is outside the cell and you can measure it as high blood glucose or high blood sugars. So they say, why isn't the glucose going into the cell? There must be resistance to it. And in response, the body increases the amount of insulin that is produced. So you get very high insulin levels in the blood, which is called hyperinsulinemia, in conjunction with insulin resistance. So the point being that this is sort of the underlying cause of all of this entire metabolic syndrome is too much insulin. If you frame it as insulin resistance, then it gets you nowhere because you say, wow, I have metabolic syndrome, therefore I have insulin resistance. Then you say, well, what caused the insulin resistance? And that's where you get into endless sort of debates. Some people say it's inflammation, and some people say it's too much dietary fat, and some people say it's carbohydrates, and some people say it's animal protein, and you get into all this sort of complicated thing. If you instead refer to it as too much insulin, so too much insulin causes all of these problems, then you're left with, well, if too much insulin is the problem, how do I get my insulin down? Now you have a simple, straightforward answer. If insulin is your problem, then you're going to not eat foods that are going to stimulate a lot of insulin, and you're going to do intermittent fasting, which is a treatment designed sort of specifically for lowering insulin, because insulin is at heart a nutrient sensor. It tells the body that nutrients are available. When you don't eat, insulin falls, and that's basically what it does. So if you're trying to drive down insulin, there's nothing more powerful than fasting. But if your entire disease is too much insulin, then fasting is a great solution. Low carbohydrate diets are a great solution.
Dr. Fung, in addition to the problems with insulin, are other hormones a factor in metabolic syndrome?
Um, there are other factors, but they tend to be relatively small. So you can have estrogen and testosterone being an issue. So if, for example, if you have certain conditions will make you a bit more insulin resistant, and they're related to the sex hormone. So you see this in pregnancy, for example. So during pregnancy, some people develop frank diabetes. It's called gestational diabetes. But it's not like their diet has changed. They haven't gained weight or anything in early pregnancy. The main change has been the change in sex hormones. So you know that there is an effect there, but it's not a big effect because most people don't have huge changes in their sex hormones. Cortisol is another issue. So, for example, if you give prednisone, you can develop frank diabetes. And that's a completely different pathophysiology. It has very little to do with the sort of insulin pathway because that's the cortisol pathway. So there are, but they tend to be relatively minor when you're talking about sort of 90-95% of metabolic syndrome. Really what you're talking about is hyperinsulinemia. So that's what I focus on.
In the response, there are different responses on a spectrum. There is keto response, and there is the low carb response. In in the diabetes code, whatever you're referring very strongly to, going low carb, why advocating that over a keto response?
Um, Low carb and keto are really sort of the same thing. One is a bit more extreme than the other. Um, uh, Doing a ketogenic diet implies, of course, that you go into ketosis, which is sort of less than about 20 grams per day. So it's fine if you want to do it, but it's not strictly necessary in order to get better because a lot of people lose weight without going into a ketogenic diet. A lot of people can reverse their diabetes without necessarily being ketotic. And that's one of the reasons that um, I don't use that word doing a keto diet or so. I have no problem if you want to do it, but it's not strictly necessary to have ketones there. The key is, again, that you want to lower insulin. The problem is too much insulin, therefore you want to lower insulin. And there's two sort of main things. One is cutting out the refined grains and cutting out the sugar. Is probably the most important thing is actually cutting out the sugar. And the second thing is really the intermittent fasting, because fasting, again, is a powerful sort of thing that you can do. And it works on a totally different sort of spectrum than the foods that you eat, because it really is only concerns about the times that you're not eating. It tells you nothing. If you're doing fasting, it tells you nothing about what you eat when you eat. So there's sort of, you need to hit both, right? Because you want to cover that entire spectrum of what to eat when you do eat and when you should be eating. That's sort of a sort of complete dietary solution, as opposed to most diets, which just say, well, you should eat this and this and this. Well, if you eat a ketogenic diet, but you eat it from sort of the minute you get up to the minute you go to bed, it's like, okay, that's still probably not very good, because you're missing sort of 50% of the problem, which is that there are times that you shouldn't be eating. When you don't eat, your insulin is going to fall, and then you're going to be able to burn off some of that blood glucose. It puts you into the fasted state. Ketogenic diets can do well. Some people can do well eating sort of constantly from sun up till sundown, but a lot of people will need to sort of get a bit of fast there. I mean, fasting is just a part of everyday life. That's why we have the term break fast, because you should be fasting at nighttime, and therefore you need to break your fast. But you don't necessarily need to do it at like 7 a.m. You can do it at like 11 a.m., or you could do it anytime you want.
Let me come to you with two topics related to what we're talking about. Number one, let's go back. If Dr. Fung is unpopular for one topic, it's going to be artificial sweeteners. And I'm here on page 186. What about artificial sweeteners? I advise patients to avoid all sweeteners, whether they contain calories or not. And
Yeah.
so in one swoop, all of the battles against stevia, xylitol, erythritol, monk fruit, etc. are just, is this because they're testing? Do they trigger insulin?
Many of them do, yes, and that's the real problem. So there's a bit of controversy because one of the stevia studies, very interestingly, said that stevia doesn't raise insulin, and then when you actually read the graph, it raises it quite a bit. And when you actually look at the insulin index, so they compared it to sucrose, for example, sugar. And when they said, it doesn't raise it, but the graph clearly said it did raise it, then because sugar is supposed to raise your insulin, they kind of took out they did this insulin index, which is what your insulin is supposed to be based on your blood glucose. And you could see that stevia had this huge effect. Um, Really, there are some people who do fine with artificial sweeteners. So definitely some people do fine. But the bottom line is this. If these sweeteners were so great, because it sounds like a really good idea, give you something sweet but no sugar and no calories. It sounds like a really good idea. But if it was such a good idea, then we wouldn't have either an obesity crisis or a type 2 diabetes crisis. We'd simply put artificial sweeteners in everything we ate, all our donuts and cookies and everything, ice cream. We just put it sugar-free, artificial sweeteners, and we wouldn't have a diabetes crisis. We wouldn't have obesity crisis. Well, if that was the case, I'd love it because then I'd just say, yeah, just eat this fake food all you want and you're not going to get fat. You're not going to get this. We'll eat fake fat. We'll eat fake sugar. We'll eat fake everything and we'll all be healthy. Uh, but it doesn't work. The bottom line is that it doesn't work. So if you want to switch over and eat all of stevia and you do well, then great, go ahead, do it. I don't really care. But most people are not going to do well. We know this because they're coming to see me for their weight problems. You think they haven't tried Diet Coke? It's like, seriously? It's not like some secret. I mean, there's huge marketing behind stevia, behind aspartame, behind all of these chemicals. And if they worked, I'd use them. I'd be the first one to tell people to use them. But I'll tell you from practical experience that it doesn't work for almost everybody. And it's not just me. It's like if you could just drink diet soda and lose weight, then you should. And people have tried. Lots of people have tried. I mean, it's like the number two selling uh, it was the number two selling brand for like decades. And now people have it's fallen a lot because most people have recognized that you're not going to lose weight by switching to Diet Coke. So that's the sort of ultimate test. Does it actually work? Because I don't really care why you think it should or shouldn't work. The fact that the key litmus test is, does it actually work? Because I don't care why you think it does and I think it doesn't. I care if it works or not. So there are going to be people who do fine with it. So, but for sort of like 80% of people, it's going to be just as bad as the sugar. Almost all studies show that whether you drink soda or diet soda, you get the same outcomes. You don't lose any weight. I mean, show me a study where people have the only thing they've done is switch from Coke to Diet Coke and lost 20 pounds. It's like, I don't think that study exists.
Right. Well, let me just ask you on behalf of all the hundreds of thousands of people in the group, if somebody is doing keto, this is a very popular question. If someone's doing keto and not eating the carbs and not eating the donuts, and they do Diet Coke, is it still going to hurt them?
I think it's going to be individual. So some people are going to do fine with Diet Coke. And if you're losing weight and you're doing your keto and drinking your Diet Coke and you're doing fine, then continue. That's my approach to everything. If you're doing your keto and drinking your Diet Coke and not losing the weight that you want, then try stopping the Diet Coke and switching to sparkling water or green tea, something like that, and see what happens. In the end, we all respond differently. So there's a recent study called the Diet Fit study. You might have seen it. It was sort of low carb versus low fat. And it was a well done study. And in the end, low carb and low fat did roughly the same. But if you look at the spread in individual patients, some people lost 30 pounds on low carb, and some people gained like 20 pounds on low carb. And it's the same for the low fat. Some people lost a lot of weight, some people gained a lot of weight. So everybody responds differently to these diets. So I can tell you what I think will work, but what will actually work is going to be different, because remember, this is the same diet that people are going on. It'll be the same. So you might do very well on Diet Coke, and the next guy will not be able to do anything on, will not be able to lose weight with Diet Coke. So again, the most important thing is that you're reaching your goal. So don't just because you do well and the next person doesn't do well doesn't mean that you're right or he's right or whatever. It just means that you need to find out what works for you. And it doesn't hurt. If you want to try Diet Coke for a month, do it. If it totally kills your weight loss, then stop it. If you're doing great on it and you do better, then continue. Why do I care?
I've got 4 questions for you.
Okay.
Question number 1, stalls. What causes a stall? What's the cure to a stall? Is there a way to avoid them, or are they inevitable?
I think stalls are, well, one, they're very, very common, even when you're doing low carb, even when you're doing keto, even when you're doing fasting. So I think that the key is to change things up. So I rarely tell people to go on a sort of a one sort of diet and just stay there, because if you are losing weight, then great, you can continue. But if most people eventually reach this point where it just kind of plateaus, then you want to shake things up. The way you shake things up almost doesn't matter. So there's lots of different ways to shake things up. You could, for example, try a long fast, change up your fasting. So instead of, if you do long fast, go to multiple short daily fasts. You could start to change your meal. So for example, if you normally eat, say, lunch and dinner, switch it up, do breakfast and lunch and skip dinner instead. You might even go to sort of a carbohydrate, sort of unprocessed carbohydrate diet, like beans and that kind of thing. You could do that. I mean, there's no sort of rules in this game, because again, thinking about it, you got to say that there are things that work for some people and not others. And the key is that if you keep to a certain diet, your body will eventually respond and will sort of plateau out. That's your body sort of adapting to what you're doing. So change it up. Eat seasonally, for example. So sometimes when it's summer, you might want to eat more vegetables. In the winter, you might want to go more to like squash and beans sort of thing. Yeah, there may be a bit higher in carbohydrates, but I personally think that there's a difference in carbohydrates between, say, wheat, which is sort of amylopectin A, and beans, which is amylopectin C. There's a huge difference in terms of insulin effect. There's a huge difference in terms of satiety and so on. So eating bread is quite different from eating black beans. There's lots of traditional societies that have done well with black beans, for example. So there's sort of an infinite number of ways you can change things up. You could go to a carnivore diet. You could go to sort of a all plant diet. Like there, I'm not sort of wed to sort of one ideology, because the key is not to be a stickler about stuff. The key is to find out what works for you. And again, what works for you is not going to be the same that what works for somebody else. And say you switch over to a carnivore diet and you feel like crap, then stop it. Like, what have you really lost? Nothing. But if you do great, then hey, continue it.
Okay, question number 2. Other point of controversy, probably your fault, we're going to blame you for it, is the rules of intermittent fasting. I mean, it's on Facebook. I think people will kill one another over which way of fasting is the best. How many days, how many times, can you have this? Can you have bulletproof while you're fasting? How many calories? Can you have chicken broth? Chicken broth, yes. Bone broth, no. How many days is it really a fast?
Yeah, there's actually no rules. I think I've only published like one rule, and that was always be safe. That is, if you are feeling like tired, so you might be hungry, that's fine. But if you're feeling tired and lethargic, that is not normal. If you're feeling nauseated, that you can't get out of bed, that is not normal. Do not continue. Stop it. Figure out what you're doing wrong. That's the only rule I think I've ever published on fasting. I called it my number one rule of fasting, but it's actually the only rule of fasting that I have. A classic fast is sort of a water-only fast. And remember, fasting only refers to the duration of time that you don't eat. So if you were to be a purist about it, fasting is sort of only water only, and then it's whatever duration you want. If you don't eat sort of between breakfast and lunch for 2 hours, that's a 2-hour fast. So anytime you do not eat, it's a fast. That's just the way it is. Now, it's a really, really short fast, and you're not going to get much benefit out of that. So some people sort of take offense to it, but it's really, that's all it is. Anytime you're not eating is a fast. So there's two different ways that fast generally differ: what is allowed during the fast and the duration of fasting. So what is allowed during the fast? Again, if you're a purist, it's only water. But some people go further and you do dry fasting, which is nothing, no water, no food. Generally, I don't recommend this, but there are certain very specific instances where it can be beneficial. Some people, for example, have a lot of diarrhea during a fast. It's very common. And I think it's because the body is trying to dump a lot of water. In that case, a dry fast, short, and dry fast should never really go more than 24 hours, might be beneficial because you don't want to put more water in and then your body wants to dump it, so you get a bunch of diarrhea. So that might be the only specific condition. Certain religious fasting, so Islamic fasting, is a dry fast, actually. I generally don't recommend it because it tends to be harder than a classic water-only fast. Then after that, anything else you add during the fast is only a variation. It's not a true fast if you want to be technical about it. The only thing, so whether you add herbal teas and green teas and coffee and bone broth and bulletproof coffee, all of those are not true fasts. So because they are sort of
And
something other
we
than
have the
water.
popular 50-calorie rule. If there's more than 50 calories, it's that you've broken your fast. I don't know where
Yeah, and it's not an all or none. So the benefits of fasting come from lowering insulin, and the benefits come if your insulin is too high, so obesity, type 2 diabetes, for example. But if you think about what insulin does during fast, it sort of comes down, right? So it's coming down, and then say you take a little meal, it's going to blip up and then start coming back down. So say you eat a little fruit or something like that. You say, it's not like your insulin's coming down. It's not going to go boom, way up. It's going to come down, come on, lip up, and then come down, come down, come down. So it's not a big deal. If you take a handful of nuts, if you take some chia seed, if you take some whatever it is that you take, your insulin's still falling. Yeah, when you eat it, it's going to blip up. So a 50-calorie rule is probably quite a reasonable one. But even up to 500 calories, like Michael Mosley, the 5-2 diet, he still gets good results with a lot of people. So again, they're all variations of fasting. So I don't allow artificial sweeteners and artificial flavors because I think it's really against the sort of the spirit of fasting, which is sort of cleansing, detoxification. Putting chemicals in really sort of goes against that sort of philosophy. So that's the only thing I really say. You really shouldn't be doing sort of Diet Coke during your fast, but you can if you want to. If you do fine, I don't really care. Um, the problem with
that.
sweeteners, I think, is that it actually stimulates appetite. So I think it makes it a lot harder to fast because if you're taking something which is sweet, you're going to get hungry, and then it's going to make the fasting a lot harder. So that's why artificial flavors is the same thing. If you take Crystal Light or one of these artificially flavored drinks, you're going to drink that and then get hungry and then wonder why fasting is so hard for you, whereas the water only crowd is like, well, you get a bit of hunger, but it's not so bad. So that's the only thing. So duration of fasting, really any time you're not eating is considered a fast. So most people start at 12 hours, though, just to give it a sort of bottom, sort of lowest acceptable number. 12 hours is sort of the minimum people consider, and then up to whatever you want. So yeah, but truthfully, yeah, you shouldn't have anything during a true sort of. This is a classic water only.
In the obesity code, you spend a lot of time talking about the falsity of calorie reduction. We have the calorie reduction error. So one of the questions comes up very, very frequently is, well, isn't keto and counting your macros to 20 carbs a day and IF, isn't that really just cutting calories?
No, and I think that as soon as you start talking about calories, you're sort of on the wrong track because calories is not a physiologic concept. That is, your body has no idea how many calories it is or isn't eating. It responds to hormones. So same thing with artificial sweeteners and artificial flavors. They have no calories, but they have other hormone stimulating effects. So I don't think even thinking about calories is useful because the body doesn't count calories. The body has no calorie receptors. It has no idea how many calories you eat. When you eat, say, a piece of bread, your glucose blood sugar is going to go up, your insulin is going to go up. When you eat an egg, that's not going to happen. It might be the same number of calories, but the metabolic response is completely different. That is, one will spike insulin like crazy, the other one won't. The egg won't, and the bread will. So how can you pretend that they're the same? They're actually nothing the same as each other. And I don't know why we would sort of pretend they are the same. It's kind of like saying, well, I could give you $100,000 US dollars, or I could give you 100,000 Argentino pesos. It's the same thing. Well, thanks. I'll take the US dollars. I'll give you the Argentinian pesos. It doesn't even make sense. So calories is just it's hard for us to get out of this because we've always been taught about calories. And there is an overlap because all foods, assuming that they're a blend of macros, is going to raise insulin to some degree. The only thing that really doesn't is if you drink sort of straight olive oil, but who does that? Not very many people. Bulletproof coffee is probably the closest you get to sort of eating pure fat on its own. And that's one of the reasons that it may actually be helpful because you're getting a lot of calories, but almost no insulin effect. But it's not very natural. It's not like something that people used to do. So yeah, the calories thing is keto is not about lowering calories. Keto is about lowering insulin. You could take the same number of calories, and same with these carnivore diets. They eat tons and tons of calories because fat is very high in calories, but they just have less insulin effect. So it's about lowering insulin and not about lowering calories. But because of this overlap between calories and insulin, that's where we get the people who say a calorie is a calorie.
So
But I
if
think it's quite
someone
wrong.
is, quote, insulin resistant, there would be a difference between paleo, including honey, dates, whatever, and keto, where they wouldn't be permitted.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can do well with both diets. So again, it's sort of I think you really need to look at insulin effect, and for that, the sort of frequency of eating is very, very important, as opposed to simply macros, which is purely answering the question of what to eat without any sort of advice on when to eat. So the difference between paleo and keto is there's a few differences there for sure. But I think you could do very well on either. To me, the most important thing is the things you get rid of, which is the refined sugars, the refined grains, most of the processed foods, refined seed oils. Getting rid of those unprocessed foods is probably the most important thing. The second most important thing, I think, is to increase the amount of time you spend in the fasting state. And I'll say that it used to be in the 70s very common for people to eat sort of 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner. So you'd get a daily 12 to 14-hour fast, sort of between dinner and breakfast the next day. So sort of between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. You get this 12-hour fast every single day. If you look at studies of how often people eat now, they the lowest 10% of people, so the first decile, is 3.3 times people eat. So from 1977, where the average person ate 3 times a day, if you only ate 3 times a day, you'd be in the lowest 10%. That is 90% of the population ate more frequently than 3 times a day. The top 10% of people eat 10 times a day. It's like, well, that's not a very good idea. So paleo, keto, low carb, that all sort of answers the what to eat question. Then you have to add on the sort of when to eat question. And there, I think you really need to sort of extend that. If you don't need to lose weight, then a 12, sort of 14-hour fast is fairly reasonable to maintain steady weight. And this is just like what they did in the 50s. They ate white bread and jam and had ice cream and cake too, and yet they didn't have obesity. But they were not eating a lot of snacks on a regular basis. Cake was special because you didn't eat it every day. So you had wedding cake, which was special because the wedding happened sort of once in your life or once when your friend is celebrating, not every day where we eat these cupcakes sort of like every day in the morning, or muffins, which are just like cakes every day in the morning. Like now you're eating cake every day as opposed to like once every 2 months sort of thing. A lot less sugar. So again, you can do well again with cutting out a lot of the refined foods, but also keeping in mind the sort of meal timing.
My guest today is Dr. Jason Fung. He is the author of The Obesity Code, The Complete Guide to Fasting, and the new Diabetes Code. Check these out. Dr. Fung, if someone wants to work with you or your team personally, how can they get in touch with you?
The best place is through my website, which is idmprogram.com. So I don't work with a lot of people personally because I can't see that many people. I actually practice nephrology mostly, which is kidney disease. But we do have a number of trained specialists. So we actually offer a lot of things. So on our website, which is idmprogram.com, we link to all of our free resources. So our philosophy really is that we provide a lot of free materials. And if you do well with the free materials, then great, we're happy to help. So there's links to all our blog posts, to the videos that we do, to podcasts and so on. And there's the Obesity Code podcast, which is our podcast that we produce as well. After that, if you need a bit more help, there's the books that you can purchase. And then we also have a sort of community program, membership community, which is sort of where we try and get a group of people all together so that they can help each other. So group forums and group fasts. Megan Ramos, who runs the program and has been working with me sort of for 15 years, answers questions on Q&A. We discuss science and so on. We get community sort of recipes and so on. So there's a lot of additional resources. That's $39 per month. So fairly affordable. And then if you really want to work sort of one-on-one with a counselor, it's actually, we do small group sessions, because one of the things that we always try to do is build in this sort of group support strategy where people can support each other. In high school, they call it peer pressure, and it has a negative connotation. But here, where we're trying to change behavior, is peer support, where people try and support each other for that. So we do small group sessions, but you get to work with somebody who will look at sort of your diet specifically and give you advice specifically in these small groups of 3 or 4. And you can purchase those from the website. So that's probably a really good resource, other than the books and so on. So yeah, they can certainly check that out if they want.
All right, folks, you don't have to go back and review this to get the name. Right below this video, we're going to have Dr. Fung's website. We're going to have his books for you. Check them out. They are terrific. They will make your mind spin like Linda Blair and The Exorcist. Really, it will change your whole perspective on health and wellness, and it might do something for your waistline too. Dr. Fung, thank you so much for being my guest today.
All right, thank you.